Hi, my name is Anjali Vandree. I am Vice President and co-founder of Family Initiative.
And I'm Kate Dumbaugh, Family Specialist with Family Initiative, as well as a foster parent.
At Family Initiative, we provide services throughout South Florida working with individuals who have disabilities and their families, as well as in the dependency system with families to help support the foster families as well as relatives and other families. Today, we're super excited to talk to you about the basics of behavior. We know a lot of families struggle with behavior issues. Any family struggles with behavior issues. And so today we're going to talk just briefly about some basic information about behavior, why it occurs, what it is, and just some general things to be aware of when you're dealing with those behaviors in the home. To start with, we want to talk about what is behavior. So when we are discussing behavior, we're talking about, from a behavioral standpoint, an action. So it's anything that a person says or does. So it has to be observable. So you can see it, you can hear it. It should be measurable. So you can count how many times it's happened, how long it's happening for, really an active sort of thing. So when we talk about behaviors, I think some of the common things we deal with are hitting, biting, kicking, crying.
Not following directions.
Yep. Yeah, so I'm sure you guys can come up with a host of behaviors that you see in your home, but always keep in mind when we're talking about those, they're actions. They're things that are actually happening that you can see, and anyone in your home can see. So at the daycare, are they saying their particular behavior is happening? So tantrums are kind of a behavior, but we want to say, well, what does that look like when the behavior is occurring? So we can really identify what exactly is happening. For us, the reason this is important to identify what we're talking about is so we know how to manage it. And a big thing is to be familiar with what you should expect. So really to have an idea of what is age typical and what's normal for a child to engage in. So I know we can talk about what do you see in a toddler, what do you see in a teenager?
So in our house, we know when we get a child who is a toddler, we're probably going to see some biting. For 3 and 4-year-olds, we're probably going to see hitting and kicking. With older children, you're going to see maybe some eye rolling, some yelling, that sort of thing. And I think really knowing this is going to happen and I am going to correct this behavior 1,000,000 times and it's not going to change. And that does not mean that I'm doing anything wrong or that anything is wrong with the child. It's just totally typical of a child of this age who has gone through trauma.
And I think that's important to note too, that even though a child might be chronologically a certain age, so let's say 6 years old, because of the trauma, because of certain diagnoses that child might have, they're not necessarily functioning at a 6-year-old level. So we know, in fact, research shows that trauma will impact their social development, their emotional development, cognitive development. So all those things, even though, like we said, Kate said she might have a 3-year-old who's going to hit. So if that child is 5 or 6, but developmentally they're at a 3-year-old level, you may see some of those behaviors because of the trauma that they've experienced. So that's a big thing to keep in mind also. And like Kate said, the change takes time. So be consistent. I know it's hard in that moment when you're frustrated and when you feel like you've been trying everything, but we tell families at least a week or 2 of trying something to see if it's going to work. And there's a lot of reasons we can go into about why it's so important, but the more consistent you are and the more patient you are with that, it will take time, but you will begin to see those behaviors change. So when considering behavior change, there's a few things that we keep in mind that are fundamental to any plan that you're going to implement and how you're going to respond to the behavior. The first thing that we always like to remember is that a child must not just be safe, they must also feel safe.
I think it's really tempting when you get a child who comes into your home right off the bat to spot behaviors that you don't want to see grow and to immediately start correcting them. And I think the thing to keep in mind, you have to build that relationship, you have to create that sense of felt safety and let the child know that they are going to be safe in your home, that you are a safe and calm caregiver before that you can make any improvement on behavior. So relationship always comes first, and Karen Purvis talks a lot about this in trust-based relational intervention and building those bonds of attachment prior to trying to shape behavior.
The next thing that we want you to keep in mind is behavior is directly influenced by the environment. So your environment matters. that also means the previous environment that they were in matters. So if you have a child who is coming from a situation where corporal punishment was used, where they were witness to violence, know that those were the behaviors that were modeled for them. That's what they witnessed. So that's going to influence their current behaviors in your home. Past behavior is a great predictor of future behavior. If that happened before, if that happened in another caregiver's home, chances are you may see it in your home as well. So be prepared for some of that. The good news about that, and I think what we get excited about, is that means that you as a foster parent or caregiver have the power to shape that behavior. It's about how you manage that behavior in your environment, which, like Kate said, once that child is safe and stable, you can start to manipulate your environment to help that child be more successful. The next thing is you have that ability to alter the behavior by changing your consequences. So when we're talking about consequences, we're talking about what happens right after that behavior. So what happens when your child hits or bites? Right after that, do you come over and intervene? Do you yell at them? Do you send them to timeout? What is your reaction to them? That's really going to shape that behavior. And this is for good and bad behaviors. How do we react? What are we teaching the child that behavior does, right? So what happens after? And you have that power. Consequences, what change that behavior? We all engage in behaviors for a reason, right? We wouldn't do them if they didn't work for us. So really figuring out what is the behavior and then figuring out the best way to deal with it. Mm-hmm. The next one, which Kate alluded to earlier, is change takes time. Depending on that child, the change may take longer. There are a lot of factors that play into that. Consistency is so important in this part because if you continually are changing your approach, that child has to spend all that time figuring out exactly what the contingencies are. So the more consistent you can be, the better the outcomes and the faster you'll start to see some of that change. So the final thing we want to keep in mind is that in the long run, behavior responds best to positive consequences. Across the state, we focus on a positive parenting approach, and that's because data shows that the best outcomes are from using this positive parenting approach. For any child, a child who's raised in a stable household with their biological family, those families who use corporal punishment, so spanking and punitive measures of that nature, those children actually grow up and have negative outcomes. There are higher rates of delinquency, higher rates of crime, higher instances of truancy. So as they continue to get older, these negative outcomes are affiliated with that early spanking. So even for a child who lives at home their entire life in a quote, stable environment. So you take a child that we are working with or who's in your home who hasn't had that experience, who's been exposed to violence or neglect, who is often in an unsafe environment, and to them they don't feel secure and safe. They are going to be operating in that base brain in the fight, flight, or freeze kind of reaction. So when you might use the punishment or spanking, and we understand it's frustrating.
So you feel like you're not making any headway in the behavior, and out of your own frustration, it's very tempting to be punitive, to yell, to want to react in a negative way. But you're going to see the greatest reward in just consistently sticking with no hurts, kind words, gentle hands, and you're going to say it a million times. And then you're going to start to hear that child repeating those phrases, and you will know that you're making progress. And it's slow and it's steady, but at the end of a year, you look back and the child who came to you is not the same child that you have now because you have been consistent and you have been kind and you have demonstrated through your own behavior, this is how people treat each other.
I think it's important because you look at, we're talking about children who come from hard places, right? They already have such a hard time building that trust and relationship. And when you use a punishment procedure, it erodes that trust relationship very quickly, even if you've been working hard at it over time and over months. Very quickly it takes them back to that place, and then you have to almost start all over in building that relationship. So again, that ties into the first thing that we talked about a child not just being safe in your home, but also feeling safe in your home. And regardless, again, of the interventions that you use as you move forward, these philosophies and thoughts will help you in implementing any one of those procedures and help make you and that child more successful. If we can provide any further information or if you have questions, please feel free to contact us. Our contact information is available. We'd be happy to talk to you about specific situations or how we can help more.